After the American Civil War, the country had this absolutely monumental task ahead of it. How do you rebuild the South and integrate millions of newly freed African Americans into the nation? This period, which we call Reconstruction, was one of the most explosive and critical moments in all of American history. And honestly, to understand America today, you really have to understand what happened back then.
You know, for a short, really hopeful moment, something truly radical was on the table. With slavery finally abolished, there was this genuine promise of creating a completely new American South, a real, functioning biracial democracy, a place where black citizens could vote, hold public office, and build their own lives. It was an incredible vision.
But that dream, that fragile hope for a new beginning, it was met with an absolutely ferocious and highly organized campaign of violence. This wasn't random chaos. It was a systematic effort to slam the door shut on that new world and crush the aspirations of Black Americans.
So that brings us to the big question we're tackling here. Why? Why was this moment of incredible potential met with such overwhelming terror? Well, to figure that out, we've got to first look at the world that this was all coming from.
Okay, so to really get the motivations behind this violence, we first have to understand the society it was desperately trying to hold on to. This was a world built on a very specific and very rigid foundation.
The thing about the pre-war South is that slavery wasn't just part of the society, it was the entire foundation. Every single aspect, the economy, the politics, the social structure, the laws, was built on the bedrock of white supremacy and the forced, unpaid labor of black people. For many white Southerners, this wasn't just a system, it was reality.
Now check this out, because this slide shows just how massive the change was. On the left, you've got the old world. Total control, black people are considered property, white supremacy is the law of the land. Then, look at the right. That entire system is completely upended. The 13th Amendment doesn't just free people, it shatters the economic and political foundation of the old Southern society. For the old white elite, this was a crisis on every conceivable level. And this quote, wow, it just cuts right to the heart of the matter. A congressional investigator in 1865 found that this was what pretty much all white Southerners believed. In their minds, violence wasn't just some extreme reaction. It was a necessary tool to control black labor and put their world back together the way it was. So the key takeaway here is this. The violence wasn't random. It was a strategy. So now that we have the why, let's dig into the how. How was this violence actually carried out? Because it wasn't just one thing, it was a multi-front campaign of terror. We can really break down this terror campaign into three main buckets. First, you had these huge, violent urban riots. Second, there was the constant, low-level threat of everyday violence. And third, and maybe the most infamous, were the organized vigilante groups like the Ku Klux Klan.
You see, cities were becoming these new centers of black political power, and that was something white conservatives just could not stand. So riots became their answer. And as you can see from this timeline, a really clear pattern emerges. These weren't spontaneous fights, they were targeted attacks, often kicked off by white mobs to crush Republican rallies or to terrorize black men for just trying to vote. And the victims were always overwhelmingly African American.
And beyond those huge riots, there was this relentless, grinding, everyday terror. A black person could be beaten or even killed over a small disagreement about work or just for not acting deferential enough. And here's the kicker. The white men who did it almost never faced any legal consequences. It created this constant state of fear that was meant to keep the old racial hierarchy in place.
And then you have the night riders. This is where the violence gets really organized. This was premeditated political terrorism. Groups like the Ku Klux Klan, they weren't just random thugs. They were essentially paramilitary organizations hiding behind masks, operating in the dead of night, and using terror as a cold, calculated weapon to achieve very specific political goals.
And this table just lays out their strategy perfectly. Look at it. They assassinated black politicians to destroy black political power. They used intimidation to scare black voters away from the polls. And they attacked black landowners and business owners to crush any hope of black economic independence. Every single act of violence had a clear, strategic purpose to tear down Reconstruction piece by piece.
And just to give you a sense of the scale of this, look at that number. 24. That's 24 Klan murders in just one county in about 2 years. In a nearby county, Klansmen drowned 30 black Mississippians in a single attack. This wasn't just a few isolated incidents. This was a brutal, widespread campaign. So,
How on earth was this horrifying violence understood at the time? Well, as you can imagine, the perspectives of the people carrying it out and the people suffering from it could not have been more different. It was like they were living in two different realities.
Now listen to this. This is from a white Southerner writing to a national newspaper. He's not apologizing for the KKK, he's defending them. He literally compares them to the American revolutionaries at the Boston Tea Party. In his mind, their terrorism was a necessary, even patriotic act to save their way of life.
Okay, now, contrast that justification with the devastating reality for the victims. This is a letter from Sally Atkins. Her husband, a Georgia state senator, was murdered by the Klan, and she writes directly to the President of the United States, begging for justice, saying there is no law for the punishment of them. Her heartbreaking plea just shows you the profound human cost of all this terror.
So what was the final outcome? Where did all this lead? Let's move into our final section and look at how the government responded, and, more importantly, how African Americans resisted and managed to build a future anyway.
You know, for a little while, it seemed like the federal government was really going to fight back. They passed these enforcement acts in the early 1870s that gave the president the power to use U.S. troops against the Klan. And for a while, it actually worked in some places. But as you can see, by 1876, the political will up north just kind of evaporated. Southern Democrats took back control, and federal protection for black citizens effectively just ended. So, in cold, hard political terms, the terror campaign worked. It was tragically successful. It helped end Reconstruction and kicked off the era of Jim Crow, a system of brutal segregation that would last for almost 100 years. But, and this is a huge but, that is not the end of the story, not even close. To stop there would be to miss the most important part, the story of black resilience. In the face of all this, African Americans refused to be dragged back into bondage. They fought back in powerful ways. They shed their slave names and took on new ones, like freemen, a huge act of self-definition. They physically walked away from the old plantations to find their own land. And most amazingly, they built their own communities from scratch, creating these incredible, defiant spaces of freedom.
And if you want a perfect symbol of that spirit, just look at Mound Bayou, Mississippi. It was founded by formerly enslaved people. It was a town where black residents owned everything, the property, the banks, the businesses. It was this powerful statement to the world that even in an era of terror, they would build their own spaces to live with freedom and dignity.
So we end up back where we started, with a question. The story of Reconstruction shows us that a community's future can be violently attacked and suppressed. But it also shows that through incredible courage, community building, and a refusal to give up, a future can be forged and defended, even in the absolute darkest of times. It's a struggle that would echo for the next 100 years.